timing was absolutely perfect, but so we can't insulate ourselves from flood warnings and hooboo. Surely there won't be a hooboo warning today, or amber alerts, but beyond that, we are in pretty good shape. So the book buying will be downstairs, and we also have a spiffy newsletter if you have a good time today and you'd like to hear more about our events, which are essentially daily. Tomorrow we have Lisa Scottolini and Hank Philippi Ryan, but it will be virtual at 11 in the morning. Monday I have Harlan Colvin at 1, and this is Gigi Pandian at 6. Those are both virtual. Robert Dugoni will be here live on Tuesday with a fabulous legal thriller. And if any of you have read Golden Age Mysteries, you may work out, well, I'll tell you and see.
Oh, yes.
You might work out basic mechanics of the plot, but if you haven't, it's going to be a real surprise. Anyway, we have a lot of fun, and I'm delighted to see Lauren. We have been together for, I think, maybe not the first Carnation book.
But definitely by the fourth Carnation book, I was coming to the pen. So Barbara has known me since before I started dating my husband, and I now have a 9-year-old. So that gives you an idea of the scope of our friendship.
It is. It's a long one. So I decided today that I would risk for the Spanish-American War. I even have my earrings from Madrid. They're not from Havana. Because Lauren, bless her, instead of doing a World War II story, of which we have had many, has decided to do earlier wars, and in fact 2 of them, about which you may not know very much. Some of you may know the Spanish-American War, but I doubt too many of you know about the Turkish War. So why don't we start with why you decided to write this book at all?
Doesn't everyone love the Greco-Turkish War? I'm waiting for the new Greco-Turkish War craze in publishing. But actually, I've been telling people this book isn't because I have a bizarre fetish for obscure late 19th century conflicts. Although honestly, if you do, everyone has their own thing. But this is actually all because of Christmas cake back in 2019. So back in 2019, Beatrice Williams, Karen White, and I were researching a book we wrote together called All the Ways We Said Goodbye. That was set during 3 quiet, uneventful periods in French history: World War I, World War II, and the 1960s. And for the World War I portion, we desperately needed to know whether a certain type of Christmas cake would have been served in occupied France during World War I. And so, because it's the sort of detail where if you get wrong, there will be one reader who knows and follows you to every single book event for the rest of your life. Anytime someone says something nice to you, they will pop up and say, but what about the Christmas cake? And so there I was madly Googling Christmas, World War I, Picardy, and I never found the Christmas cake. We wound up cutting out that one line, by the way.
Is this a French Christmas cake? Or
French Christmas cake. No, this is a particular sort of bûche de Noël served in Picardy. It has its own weird name, but we couldn't figure out during the German occupation, when ingredients were scarce, would they still have made it?
Or chocolate, because that's an essential part of the bûche de Noël.
I think this one is based on creme de marron. But anyway, we wound up never actually being able to track down whether or not they would have the Christmas cake. But what did pop up was a memoir by a Smith College alumna talking about throwing Christmas parties in the Somme in 1917. And I thought, this is insane. What are a group of Smithies doing in the Somme in 1917, dressing up as Father Christmas with the shells falling around them? So I dropped everything, as any good procrastinating author would do. I read that memoir, and I discovered that, in fact, there were Smithies in the Somme, and in fact, a whole troop of them, who had been put together as an aid organization by an eccentric and charismatic alumna, Harriet Boyd Hawes. And as I was writing my book about the Smith College Relief Unit, how many people have read Band of Sisters? Oh, yay. So that half of the room knows what I'm talking about. This half of the room doesn't. That book was about the Smith College Relief Unit, 18 Smithies who went over to the Somme in 1917 to bring aid to French villagers whose villages had been very deliberately decimated by the Germans and who then were sent back to starve and be a burden on the French war effort. And Harriet Boyd Hawes, this brilliant, she's a little bit Amelia Peabody. She was an archaeologist, a humanitarian, an occasional war nurse. Her idea was, if you've got a problem, you send American college women, because a bright woman can solve anything. And she got together a troupe of 18 Smith College alumni, and managed to get all the relevant paperwork, pushed back against so much, pushed back, and got them out to the Somme. But as I was reading about this, and as I was writing this book, I became increasingly fascinated by Harriet Boyd Hawes, who was both some people loved her, and they adored her attitude of, you're a bright woman, you can do anything, and other people despised her. And one of the big sort of dramas towards the beginning of Band of Sisters was that she gets ousted as leader of the unit because, again, some people think she's brilliant and some people think she's a train wreck. And I wanted to know more about her. What shapes a woman who can come up with the idea of dropping 18 college women into a war zone in 1917? And so, of course, I discovered her past was just as amazing as you would have imagined, that as a young Smith graduate in the 1890s, she had gone off to Greece to study at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, determined to be an archaeologist. But the school was run by a Dartmouth guy who felt firmly that women do not have the right constitution to excavate. And so she was told she could be a classics librarian. That was okay, but she could not dig. And in a fit of pique, she went off, as one does, and took a Red Cross training course, which she failed, but pulled strings with Queen Olga of Greece, with whom she had become friends, which you do if you're Harriet Boyd, and got herself sent to the front anyway. A year after the Greco-Turkish War, she's back in Greece digging up Crete, and has this amazing dig where she funds her own dig and makes incredible discoveries at a place called Gornia, and proves once and for all that women can excavate and can manage a large excavation team, and people are still reading her work today. But in the in-between the Greco-Turkish War and the digging Gornia, she goes back to the United States to join Clara Barton and the Red Cross nursing in the Spanish-American War. And I thought, why? Why is she, what? Why is she going back to nurse in the Spanish-American War? That's a big trip. That's not like you hop on a plane. This is months and months of travel, weeks and weeks of travel. And I became even more curious as I read her biography and her articles, and there's very little reference to the Spanish-American War. So many other things. There are chapters and chapters dedicated to her adventures as a student in Greece. There are 5 pages just on one wedding she stumbled into in a Greek hill town, but almost nothing on the Spanish-American War, 1 paragraph. And I thought, wait, what is she hiding? What is she not telling us? When I was a grad student, we used to be told to look for the silences, look for what people are hiding. I thought, what is she hiding? What happened in Greece that sent her to Cuba? And what happened in Cuba that she's not talking about? And so that's how I got pulled into 2 very obscure late 19th century conflicts, because this book is the answer to that question. And it's the story of my fictionalized version of that real woman. My version of her is named Betsy Hayes. In Band of Sisters, she's Mrs. Rutherford, Betsy Hayes Rutherford. But in this book, she's just plain old Betsy Hayes, who has just graduated from Smith and is determined to make her mark on the world.
It's interesting that you've written them upside down.
Exactly. I wrote them backwards, which, as anyone who knows me knows, is kind of classic me. I kind of stumble into things in a topsy-turvy way. But I don't know if anyone here did this along with me. Last year, I did a read-along for all 12 books of my Pink Carnation series on Zoom, a book a month with a guest host. So I'm doing a Smithiad read-along in the fall with 2 Wars in a Wing in September and Band of Sisters in October, because I want to read the books in the correct order and see how they read when I read them the right way around.
Are you looking to make this a trilogy? Are you going to carry it on, or do you think this is enough?
I had thought about making it a trilogy because there's a lot of pressure to write World War II books. I know this is heresy at the moment, I really hate World War II books. But there is a French orphan in Band of Sisters named Zélie, who I became very attached to. And so I did toy with the idea of giving Zélie her own book in World War II. But fortunately for me, before I got dragged into World War II, a completely unrelated historical rabbit hole popped up. And so now I'm writing about something completely unconnected, different time period, different place.
Why is it that you gravitate to historical fiction more than contemporary?
funny because, I actually do also love contemporary fiction.
I know you read a lot of it. I sell you a lot of it.
That is true. You know my reading habits better than most people. And when I wrote my Pink Carnation series, my original books and my early historical fiction all had a modern frame story. And I adored writing those modern characters. I love the snark. But fundamentally, I have always wanted to visit other time periods. The book that had me proclaim to my class, my first grade class, that I was going to be a writer when I grew up, was E.L. Konigsberg's A Proud Taste for Scarlet and Miniver, about Eleanor of Aquitaine. So historical fiction has really always been my writing home, although my secret ambition has always been to write a series of snarky modern mysteries a la Elizabeth Peters' Vicky Bliss. So maybe someday.
Well, I think part of it is you like the research. She's already mentioned she's gone down rabbit holes.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it. Let's go back to the archaeologist thing. There were not a lot of professions that women in the late 19th century were admitted to. It was, you had to ask yourself to some degree, what were they doing with their Smith College degrees? What profession could they actually go into? But if you look at the 19th century, maybe you read Deanna Rayburn's wonderful books about Veronica Speedwell. Veronica Speedwell were earlier in time as a lepidopterist, because there was this huge interest in the 19th century, particularly in Victorian England, to look at the natural world as a kind of, I think, a antithesis to industrialization. So Veronica made a fortune by going out and hunting down rare butterflies and bringing them back to butterfly collectors. And museums began as what are called cabinets of curiosities, where rich people, or not even rich people, but people who had some means, could collect butterflies or geodes or beetles, or it didn't really matter. And they would put them in furniture, a cabinet, and then as they got bigger, they eventually became the Ashmolean, the British Museum, whatever, as these collections grew. So it was okay for a woman to be a lepidopterist. Sometimes they could be kind of an early paleontologist, and they could, in fact, be archaeologists. They weren't well paid. I mean, that wasn't really part of the deal.
Yes.
But if they were Smith College graduates, most of them probably had some sort of private money.
Well, that's
So it wasn't
interesting
gonna
too. When you think about it, a lot of their male counterparts were not well paid either.
That's right.
A lot of these were gentlemen's or gentlewomen's professions, where you had family money staking you, and you studied ancient Greece and collected marbles because you could. And it's very different from our modern idea of professionalism.
Well, you weren't in trade. Trade was the thing. If you were actually salaried for doing something, trade was considered, I don't want to say sort of, it's not fair, but
Tainted, mildly tainted.
Right. Gentlewomen didn't do that. And so, again, you could be an archaeologist. Now, many of you probably heard of Gertrude Bell, who was an explorer and to some degree, I suppose, dug things up. But she made herself an expert on what is today Iraq and so forth. And when World War II, when it came to the Treaty of Versailles and how they were going to apportion the peace, they used Gertrude Bell as their expert, which is one of the reasons this came up in I'm trying to remember what author, what day is it? Whatever author I was talking to the other day, pointed out that because Gertrude Bell didn't understand the tribal nature of Iraq, and she looked at it as geographical, her decisions did not age well, and it led to much of the conflict that we have today. But the interesting question is, why Gertrude Bell, as opposed to all kinds of other people who maybe could have had. So maybe there was a certain kind of mystique, do you think, about women who were that successful?
I mean, there was also in Europe, I'm blanking, I think I am getting her name wrong, but you'll remember Barbara, groundbreaking late 19th century Egyptologist and lecturer, Amelia Emerson?
No, that's Amelia Peabody.
Sorry, of course. See, I told you I was mixing her name up, but she's...
I do this too. It's the woman that Amelia Peabody was based on. Do any of you know who
we're talking about? Or you can go,
Amelia Peabody?
Okay. Oh yes, Amelia Peabody is Elizabeth Peters' archaeologist heroine, and what I found so fascinating was Harriet Boyd the real woman my fictional character in Two Wars and a Wedding is based on had decided she wanted to be an archaeologist because she had, Amelia Edwards. She had heard Amelia Edwards lecturing in Boston about her discoveries in Egypt. And then she went to Smith and studied classics and was determined to do the sorts of things Amelia Edwards had done in Egypt in Greece, only to bump up against this Dartmouth man who was running the American school and said, you just don't have the stamina to endure the physical rigors and hardships of a dig.
There were other considerations too, which was birth control is really chancy. And women, could get pregnant in many unfortunate ways. Well, the normal, but it could turn out to be. So, and in fact, Amelia Edwards was asked at one point how she and her husband managed not to have children while they were speeding up the Nile and so forth. And her answer was abstinence. That was the only actual foolproof birth control method available to her. But I think one of the reasons that women were frowned upon was that there was a concern that they would in fact get pregnant and then would create all kinds of problems.
Well, and there was this idea too that women were a distraction. They would rile up the men. And I mean,
towards getting pregnant.
Towards getting pregnant. And I mean, it's true that one scene I actually cut from this book. I mean, there are ways in which women are genuinely more vulnerable. So in this book, who knows who the Schliemans are? Heinrich Schliemann and his wife Sophia. Okay, he was the one who dug up Troy. He also excavated Mycenae, and he worked with his wife. Is it Sophia or Sophia?
Well, if it's Greek.
Is it Sophia? I've been saying Sophia, but I have no idea if I'm getting it wrong.
I'm not really sure.
It just sounds more exotic that way. Anyway, his wife Sophia, who was a young Greek woman who he married, actively worked on excavations with him. But there is a big scholarly debate about whether or not Sophia Schliemann was actually an archaeologist and can be counted as such. And one of these articles, the archaeological career of Sophia Schliemann that attempted to eviscerate her archaeological reputation, made me so livid that I included a scene in the book where she meets with my heroine, who is asking her about how she did it, how she actually worked on all these digs. And well, first Sophia Schliemann tells her, you need to find yourself an archaeologist for a husband. That bit did stay in the book. But she also tells her a story about the time a workman tried to rape her and what you have to do to earn and maintain the respect of the men, and then so they don't see you as an object of potential lust. And that scene I wound up cutting from the book for length reasons, but I think it was a real consideration. You're out there in the field, and as a woman, you are vulnerable.
Plus, this was a somewhat uncredentialed field. For example, Heinrich Schliemann was actually a German grocer. He was not professionally trained. He had a lot of money, and he decided, based upon, I don't know, whether he was just reading Homer or what, that he could figure out where Troy was. There is still some debate whether it actually is Troy, but if you should sail, as I have done, if you sail up towards Istanbul through from the Black Sea through the Dardanelles, there's now a big wicker horse there in order to sort of mark the spot of the Trojan horse. And you don't know whether Troy was actually a major city. I mean, it's all kind of lost in time, but there are various layers of it. But there's a very famous picture many of you may have seen of Sophia wearing the Trojan horde. She has all the gold. Have any of you seen it?
Yes.
She has like a crown, and it has the dangles.
And it was sort of marketed as Sophia Schliemann wearing the gold of Helen.
Right.
And of course it was never Helen's gold, it was someone else's gold, but it certainly looked good.
And then the Germans stole it, and or rather the Russians stole it from Germany, because when I went to visit it in Berlin, there's a card that says, sorry, but it's now in Moscow. So when the Russians liberated Germany, so to speak, at the end of the Second World War, they also lifted a great many archaeological treasures, among which is the Schliemann Trojan horde.
But of course this brings up an interesting point, which is that at this period, archaeology was in a somewhat intermediate state between being a treasure hunt and treasure grab, and archaeology as we now know it as a discipline and a form of science. So my heroine visits a bunch of digs, including the French dig at Delphi, And they are, a lot of what they do, I think archaeologists now would sort of clutch their pearls and fall over in a swoon. There was a lot of digging for treasure and not as much sort of dating and documenting. It was like, ooh, what can we find if we dig here?
Yeah, there's a lot of destruction as a result. Anyway, let's go back to your book, because we've digressed, as we always do. So you have your heroine, and she's in Greece, in not being received with open arms, and she meets, wait for it, a charismatic Frenchman.
That's my God.
We come back to the whole question I raised earlier, sex, right? So we have a charismatic Frenchman. How much do you want to say about him?
Well, I mean, he was a very fun character to write. So he's an older archaeologist, and he's the reason she visits the dig at Delphi, by the way. And my heroine, she is a young American. She's just out of college, and it is heady being in Europe among these European sophisticates. But I think part of the context for this too is that at this point, Athens is really trying to become a major European capital. And you have not just sort of people at digs, you have representatives from all of the major archaeological schools there in Athens. You've got the British school, the French school, and the German school. So if you're there as an American, you're hanging out with these scholars from all nations. And on top of that, my heroine, and this is another one of these crazy things where truth is stranger than fiction. So the real-life Harriet Boyd, who my Betsy Hayes is based on a train to Paris on her way to Greece, she wound up in a compartment with Sarah Bernhardt's sister-in-law. That I did not include in the book, by the way. But thanks to that connection, instead of having to room with a Presbyterian minister, like the only other female student at the school, she got invited to stay at the home of a Greek aristocrat. And through that Greek aristocrat, Ekaterini McHugh, she wound up in aristocratic social circles in Greece, where she met the royal family, but also this wonderful, dissolute, late 19th century, so very Belle Epoque European social milieu, which was very different from anything she had encountered in Boston at the time. I mean, the worlds were, think about Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad. The worlds were so different back then. And so there's something very heady, I think, for my heroine about being in this milieu where she's meeting all of these worldly people who are part of old Europe and old families, and she is the new money daughter of a carpet factory owner from Yonkers, who then moved to Boston to try to polish up their new money a bit. But I mean, the stench of the carpet factory is still with them. And I think, so in many ways, my attractive French aristocrat archaeologist, to her embodies this new world that she is dipping a toe into. And he's charming, he's mysterious, he drops comments about the time when he thought he wanted to be an Egyptologist after drinking too much absinthe in Paris, and sort of wandering the world searching for truth. And of course, for an American who's never been anywhere but Yonkers, Boston, and Northampton, this is incredible. This is thrilling stuff. And so she's very vulnerable. And it's that phase, even now, not just the 1890s, when you're just out of college, where you feel like you're on top of the world and you're a grown-up and you know everything. And of course you're the equal of a 40-year-old French aristocrat. But of course, we all know, as she does it, that she is way out of her depth.
And he's married.
Which he does not tell her immediately.
No, he's married. So, things are difficult for her, and you can see why she might have decided that fleeing to Havana. That's a very odd war in our country's history. It's often called the Yellow Journalism War. William Randolph Hearst wanted to sell a lot of newspapers, and there was a Fox News parallel, for sure, going on there. But in any case, there's a U.S. battleship called the Maine that mysteriously blew up in Havana Harbor. Nobody knows for sure.
And they're still debating that? They still are going back and forth on whether it was a coal bunker fire or whether it was deliberately mined. Right. I'm trying to remember who it was. There was a dig, or not a dig, underwater excavation or whatever it was, like 5 years ago, where they made the argument again that maybe it actually was the Spanish. And then there was another counter one that said, no, it was a bunker fire. I think the general consensus is that it was a coal bunker fire. But
it was enough to spark off, American retaliation. Sometimes wars are fought on the dumbest pretext. And I asked somebody, not long ago, we do a lot of military fiction events, and two guys that had served a lot and are now writing military fiction because that's a platform for these guys, pointed out that wars generally develop when one side underestimates the other, which is what we're looking at in the Ukraine, right? It's what we were looking at Munich in 1938. It's all too easy to underestimate the tenacity of the person that the country, whatever it might be, that you're going after. And so I think that was true.
Oh, that was definitely the case. The U.S. thought that Spain was an aging, decrepit empire, and that our boys would just go in and, it's amazing that we won. We won by pure chance and luck in a lot of ways. Because one of the things, so I don't know, if you're anything like me, all you remember about the Spanish-American War from AP history is Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. And honestly, most of that wasn't even from AP history. It was because I was in a production of Arsenic and Old Lace in upper school where I played Aunt Abby. And there's that brother who's always running upstairs shouting, "Charge!" because he thinks he's Teddy Roosevelt at San Juan Hill. So when I went into this book, when I went and chased Betsy Hayes to Cuba, reading about the Spanish-American War was a real revelation to me. And I found out that things like, for example, the Spanish had smokeless powder. So when they fired, you couldn't see where they were firing from. They had a very up-to-date military. Our boys were still firing with old-fashioned black powder that they had used in the American Civil War. So the Spanish could see exactly where they were firing from. So I gave a presentation to my daughter's 3rd grade class for Women's History Month last week on the Spanish-American War and Clara Barton and the Red Cross nurses. And I was trying to think of a way to explain the Spanish-American War to them. So I eventually described it as, imagine your father has packed for you for spring break, but he forgot to include the Neosporin and the bandages, and forgot the bags that had your swimsuit and the sunscreen, and on top of that, you wound up having to leave a bunch of your siblings at home because he didn't buy enough plane tickets. And that's the Spanish-American War. And they're like, oh, we get it now, because no one thought this war through. They started sending troops to Tampa to embark for Cuba, but they had no idea how to get the troops there. There weren't enough ships. And so the Rough Riders, I showed the girls a picture of the Rough Riders on horseback waving their sabers. And it's like, well, there's something in this picture that shouldn't be. And there's something missing from this picture that should be there. And the something that shouldn't have been there were those horses. That, yes, they were a cavalry troop, but they realized they didn't have enough ships for the men, much less the horses. And so the horses all got left back in Florida. And the Rough Riders were there complaining that they shouldn't be called the Rough Riders anymore. They should be called the Weary Walkers, because that's what they were doing. They were a cavalry troop without horses. And of course, the picture also didn't have a single woman in it, when in fact, as we know, there were both female nurses and journalists there in Cuba during the Spanish-American War who you never hear about. They do not show up in any of the major books. You really have to hunt for them.
That's true. Journalists were a big part of it. There was a lot of propaganda involved. When the war was over, we acquired we didn't really acquire Cuba, but that's where the Philippines came into the U.S. orbit. Was that also Puerto Rico?
Oh gosh, I don't remember. That was out of the mandate of my book.
No, I think so. It was sort of a comprehensive treaty. So sometimes the spoils of war are larger than you expected. I don't think anybody was really thinking about acquiring the Philippines when they went to Florida
Nobody expects to acquire the Philippines.
Right.
Yes.
Well, we may at the moment, because bad things are happening in the South China Sea. But anyway, so it was a war to a great degree based on journalism and propaganda, which we flukily won. But there were there were casualties, and therefore a role for Clara Barton. When did she get started? Was she a Civil War?
She was the angel of the battlefield in the Civil War. And then she spent some time in Europe and saw the Red Cross and thought, this is amazing. We need one of these over here in the U.S. And she lobbied subsequent American presidents until she found one that was willing to support her in founding a U.S. Red Cross. So she was the president of the American Red Cross. And when war broke out in Cuba, she and her Red Cross nurses from the New York Red Cross Hospital were already in Cuba, bringing aid to starving Cuban women and children. Because a large part of the impetus for the war was because, of course, there was a war of independence in Cuba against Spain, and the Spanish did not like that. And there were really nasty reprisals, including what they called reconcentration camps, where they pulled Cuban civilians off their farms, away from their homes, and stuck them in camps. And about 250,000 Cubans starved. And this was where Hearst and people, they were writing articles about it. And to the point where a U.S. senator said it can't really be that bad, and went down to investigate and came back and gave a report to Congress saying, actually, it's really that bad. And so Clara Barton and her nurses were there bringing aid, supplies, medical care to the Cuban civilian population when word of war came. And like all American civilians, they were ordered to leave Cuba immediately, but they only sailed on Clara Barton's ship, the state of Texas, as far as Florida, where Barton sent telegrams to everyone, to the president, to the Secretary of War, to the Army Surgeon General, saying, we're here and we're ready to serve. And we will do what we do, and we will nurse the soldiers in battle. And basically she got back, okay, well, don't call us, we'll call you. And they didn't call. No one contacted her. She waited for a summons that didn't come, because the Army Surgeon General was firmly of the opinion that female nurses had no place on a battlefield, that the only thing they were fit for was preparing food for the male nurses to serve. Leaving the nurses to the real nurses, the male nurses. So Clara Barton sailed to Cuba anyway. It's sort of tragically funny, this idea of Cuba Barton sailing around looking for the battles so they could help. And they finally got word that there had been a big battle and the wounded were pouring into the port town of Siboney. So they sailed in, they docked, and they went to the U.S. Army Hospital and offered their services, and were told by the major in charge that they were not needed. And the nurses got to look around the hospital. It was an abandoned warehouse. The men were lying on bare boards. They had no blankets. They had no cots. They had no pillows. They were burning up with fever. They were crawling with vermin. The stench was indescribable. And there was a nurse standing out on the veranda smoking a cigarette, not doing anything for the men. But the major was obdurate. No need for women in his hospital. So they walked down to the Cuban Army Hospital and offered their services there. And the Cubans were like, great, just let us clean up for you. And Clara Barton said, no, give us a mop, we'll be fine. And it created such a ruckus in the American hospital where they were like, whoa, why are we not getting this treatment? That eventually Clara Barton did get a message saying, okay, if you want to, you can come, nurse. But she refused to go in that hospital. She got her own building and set it up as a Red Cross hospital. And that became the center where all the American wounded came through. And actually, in the height of battle, and this is the one bit you will find about these women, Clara Barton got a message from General Shafter himself, the head of the whole army in Cuba, saying, we need you on the battlefield, can you come? And Clara Barton, 76 years old, climbed into a wagon and was jolted along to the front where she set up operations. And so when I was working on this book, I knew there were Red Cross nurses in Cuba because I knew Harriet Boyd had gone to join them, and I couldn't find them anywhere. And I was looking in the indexes of all of these recent, very good books about the Spanish-American War, and the one reference to Red Cross or Cuba I found in any of them was one line about Clara Barton showing up at the battlefield, and the boys saying, hurrah, Clara Barton is here, now we'll be okay. And she made everyone cite her. But that's it. No mention of how she got there, no mention that she was running a hospital, no mention of any other nurses in Cuba. And the only reason we know any of this, aside from her memoirs, she did like writing her memoirs, was because traveling with her were female journalists who were writing dispatches home, because there were a whole bunch of female, as Barbara mentioned, journalism was such a huge part of this war. And Teddy Roosevelt was traveling with his own private entourage of journalist buddies. He was sharing a tent with Richard Harding Davis. And actually, what the first battle the Red Friars encountered in Cuba, I'm going to mispronounce this because I don't speak Spanish. It was a place called Las Guasimas. Anyway, pardon the atrocious pronunciation. But Roosevelt goes into battle chatting with Edwin Marshall, Richard Harding Davis and Stephen Crane, and they're so busy talking about this lunch they went to at Delmonico's that they don't hear the bullets starting. So it's Teddy Roosevelt and 3 journalists walk into the Spanish lines. I paraphrase slightly, but he was traveling with all of these journalists who were right up there in the front lines with him. In fact, he even brought a Vitagraph moving picture company team with him. But meanwhile, there were also female journalists who had gone to Florida in the hopes of covering the war, and they were told no, that they could not interview the men in the camps in Florida because they would be disruptive, and they certainly couldn't sail to Cuba. So Clara Barton heard about this and saw an opportunity, and she said, you can sail with me. Just 2 things. You have to write articles about the Red Cross, and you have to do some nursing, because I don't carry dead weight. And they did. They nursed around the clock, and they wrote these amazing dispatches for the Chicago Record, the New York Journal, and other papers detailing all of this. Yeah, sorry, I've been going on.
No, it's okay. I was just thinking how many people obviously had never heard of Florence Nightingale in the Crimea, which was 30 years before, because it was a very similar situation.
Well, there's a really interesting passage that was recorded in one of these articles by one of these journalists who traveled with Clara Barton, a woman named Catherine White, who was writing for the Chicago Record, and they toured while they were waiting to get the call from the U.S. Army to come to Cuba, they toured a hospital ship called the Solace, and Clara Barton kept talking about her service in the Civil War, and the surgeon kept very patronizingly telling her, well, that was back then, when people didn't really know what they were doing. It's all changed. And so there was this idea that female nurses in the 1850s and 60s, that was fine. Those were primitive times. But now that we're all men of science, no, we don't need women anymore.
Right, so we've lost the story once again.
Sorry.
So anyway, you brought Betsy. She's over in the Spanish-American War. And again, we can't tell you what, life-changing things happen, and she ends up going back. So that's all we're going to say, right?
Yes.
Because otherwise we would spoil it. So the book is really a story. It's not history. It's not nonfiction, in case you're thinking that it might be. But the background is fascinating, and I do think, people, it's often said, and I believe it's true, that people don't read history or doomed to repeat it. And if, in fact, more people had paid any attention to Florence Nightingale and her nursing career in the Crimean War, which was 1864, I think it was.
1854.
54? Was it? Okay, so even earlier. Then perhaps it would have been simpler during the Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt got himself elected president as a consequence of all of this. So lots of seminal things happened, but it is a really interesting period, and Betsy, I think, is a memorable character. Any of you have questions that you might like to ask? Yes, are you running out of juice?
No. Deb Helsher would like to know if which biographies did you recommend for reading about Harriet Boyd?
Oh gosh, there's one called Born to Rebel by Mary Ollisbrook, who was her daughter, and wrote the most detailed, tongue-in-cheek, lovely biography. It's the perfect summary of Harriet Boyd's life. The first line is, I failed at bringing up mother. Because you can tell, Mary Ollisbrook adored her mother, and she tells her adventures with such relish, but she's also not unaware of the fact that her mother was very eccentric and could not be trusted not to wander off into war zones and then reorganize them.
Also, a lot of Smith women say hello.
Oh, hello.
I was going to say the same.
Oh, how marvelous. Well, I felt so honored to get to travel in the footsteps of these amazing, groundbreaking smithies.
So, call on people.
Oh yes, there's one arm that was up there in the back. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I want to know, how did Clara Barton get her own building in Cuba?
Well, I mean, it's a small Cuban port town, and so she found and so many areas in Cuba had been largely abandoned because of the Spanish policy of reconcentration. So there were a lot of empty buildings, and the Rough Riders wrote home about passing abandoned plantations that had been thriving concerns, not so very long ago, but were now already being overgrown with jungle. And so a lot of these places had a very deserted aspect. And so, for example, when you look at pictures of these buildings, they look very we're not talking sort of grand Beaux-Arts mansions. They're sort of one step up from shacks. So she found her own abandoned building to go put her own hospital in, and in fact it wasn't large enough. And so what they wound up doing was they set up tent wards. As the wounded kept pouring in, they kept putting up tents. So there was a tent in which they did surgery, and a tent in which they put the wounded men, and so on. Yes.
Lauren, as you know, there are quite a few smithies here.
Yay, I'm so delighted.
And we were wondering why you did research. We were very excited about that, reading Band of Sisters for our book club. And we're curious as to what brought you to the research about Smith, because that's not your alma mater and it's ours.
Yes. Well, thank you for letting me tread on your territory. It really was because having fallen into that memoir on the hunt of that missing Christmas cake, I was so enthralled and fascinated by these women. And although I am not a Smithy, I am an all-girls school girl. And I attended a small all-girls school in New York from kindergarten to 12th grade. And our legendary headmistress, who had been there for 50 years and was an iron spine in a Laura Ashley dress, she was a Smithy. And she used to call us together and give us a speech about how Smith had changed her life. And how, with an education like we were being given at Chapin and she had been given at Smith, we owed it to the world to go out and do something incredible. And so when I started reading the letters of these Smithies from the front, I felt such a sense of kinship. I could hear my old headmistress's voice, and I realized so much of what she tried to teach us and what she tried to instill in us came from that Smith tradition of service. And so I felt such a pull towards these women.
We were thrilled.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what it was like as a writer to write these two different books, because the Band of Sisters, you had a completely different set of letters to work from than you did for this book. So what was it like, and how did you handle those challenges?
Well, it was such a different experience because with Band of Sisters, as you were saying, the Smith College archives were incredible. They digitized thousands of letters for me. I couldn't get up to Northampton because I had two very small children at the time. My son was just 1. My daughter was 5. Gosh, I should remember their ages. Anyway, they were very young. I couldn't get away. And so the Smith College archivists sent me this tremendous file of thousands and thousands of their letters. And I was drowning in primary sources. It was every historian and historical novelist's dream, not just to have one account of the event with details, but to have multiple accounts of the same event with dialogue and lots of strong personal opinions from different perspectives. So with this book, once I turned in Band of Sisters, I knew I had to write Mrs. Rutherford's story back when she was Betsy Hayes. And I emailed Smith College Archives saying, would it be possible for me to get my hands on Harriet Boyd's papers? Because I knew they have a whole bunch of her stuff up there in the Smith College Archives. And there were so many gaps in what I knew about her. I was really hoping there'd be something about that missing Spanish-American wartime in there, because I really wanted to know what she was hiding. And, well, the short story is, this was in April of 2020. I got a very lovely form email back saying the library is closed, we're not digitizing anything for anyone. Please do not come here personally either. And by the way, we're also moving to a fabulous new building, so we're going to be closed even longer. So I wasn't able to get my hands on the primary documents at Smith College, and I panicked. Because of course I had so relied on those for Band of Sisters, but in some ways I think it was really a very good thing that I couldn't get my hands on those primary sources. Because as Barbara was saying, this has a lot of history in it, but it's also a story. And my heroine is not Harriet Boyd, although I steal a lot of Harriet Boyd's life for her. She's my fictional Betsy Hayes. And because I couldn't find out what happened to the real Harriet Boyd in the Spanish-American War, I had to let my fictional character develop as her own person and make it up. And also, really got to weave in the lives of other real women who had been to Cuba during that conflict in a way I wouldn't if I had had those actual Harriet Boyd papers. the other reason it was a good thing was, unless I had missed something, when I did finally manage to sort of dig a little further, what I found out was I don't think there was any big secret for Harriet Boyd. That she got to the Spanish American War late, never made it over to Cuba, nursed in Florida, and then decided actually she really did want to be an archaeologist after all. So there was no big secret. And if I had found that out in April 2020, it would have killed the book. As it was, my Betsy Hayes does have a big secret, and you'll find it out in the book.
That's true. You've got to be careful not to be writing nonfiction.
Yeah.
Because it's all too easy if you do tons of research to let that overtake the book, and then you lose the story.
Well,
There's one.
wasn't there something very controversial about Mrs. Rutherford?
There were many controversial things about Mrs. Rutherford. Which one were you thinking of?
Well, from the Band of Sisters, right? And
Yeah.
they said, oh, this terrible thing happened, and so they were removing her.
Yes, well, I mean, so in Band of Sisters, this is not a big spoiler for those of you who haven't read it because it's fairly close to the beginning of the book. She gets her group out to the Somme, and one woman has a nervous breakdown and has to go home. And anyway, so as I mentioned before, some people adored her, some people could not stand her and thought that what she was doing, bringing Smithies out to the front, was criminally irresponsible. Because when she takes them out there in the autumn of 1917, no one knew that the Allies were going to win the war. I mean, at that point, there was every chance that Germany was going to break through the lines and overrun the area where they're trying to help villagers, because their mandate was to go reconstruct these French villages that had been destroyed, because people are living there without proper shelter, without medical care, without food, and there are these poor children who haven't been to school for 3 years. And so they're there trying to build buildings, they're bringing chickens so they could provide eggs for the villagers. They're bringing, they're milking cows and all these sorts of things. And some people really thought this is an insane idea, because all of this could be destroyed in a moment if the Germans break through. We should concentrate on winning the war and then reconstruct. And Harriet Boyd Hawes was very firm that there were people who needed help right now, and they could not wait until the end of the war. And it didn't matter if their lives were in danger. These people mattered. And so the whole unit started because she gave a speech to the Smith College Club in Boston in April of 1917, and one of the lines in that speech always makes me cry. And it's, people ask me how I could leave my own children and go over to the other side of the world, but all is well with my children. And there are other children with whom all is not well, and their lives too are precious in the eyes of God. And I mean, she felt that very strongly. And so when members of the unit pushed back and said, we should stay in Paris, we should do war work, our boys have finally entered the war, they're coming over, we should be helping them, and then once we win the war, that's the most that's the best help we can give to the French, then we can rebuild these villages. And she said, no, these children will be dead by then, and we have to go do this now. And the ironic thing for those of you who have not read the book, she gets her group out into the Somme, but the faction who wanted to remove her succeeded. They claimed she was unstable. And so she was removed as director of the unit, but they continued her work. Even though, because she had got them out to the Somme fast enough that they'd already started work. Had the faction trying to remove her been about a month faster, I would never have had the story of the Smith College Relief Unit to tell you, because it would have all been about doing war work in Paris and would not have been nearly as exciting.
Did you have a question, PK, from the audience?
Yes, so Elizabeth Lefebvre from,
Hi.
I think she's Minnesota. I apologize if I got your place wrong, Elizabeth. She wanted to know about why so many great female nurses and other women of history are so quickly and easily forgotten, in your opinion.
That is a really good
I
question.
have an answer.
Oh, go ahead.
Because history is seldom written by women. I once belonged to a book club, and that was our theme for the entire year, is where are the women's voices in history? If you go back and look at Tudor England, for example, we know what Shakespeare had to say, but we hardly ever hear from women.
And I think
that's why it's gotten lost.
Well, the problem is, and that because we have not heard those voices, we fall back on that Victorian fallacy that women were just at home, minding the hearth,
Right.
playing the harp, having tea in the parlor. And in fact, that's not at all the case. I had a good friend in grad school whose topic was female merchants of the Middle Ages. You had women out there running major companies. And I studied, my thing originally was female Renaissance monarchs, and there were a lot of them. There have always been women doing all these amazing things, but we work on the assumption that they weren't because we have not seen them in these stories, which is why I think it's so important to write them back into the story so that we know that women were there. So when I spoke to my daughter's third grade class, one of the things I did was I showed them a picture, a classic picture of the American Revolution and a World War I picture. You know, both sort of the standard history textbook fare, and there is not a woman in sight in either of them. And then I showed them a picture of Nancy Morgan Hart, who is one of the female heroines of the American Revolution, and I showed them a picture of the Smith College Relief Unit, and said, look, these women were right there, right out of the frame of the picture, and there are many, many more like them. Because actually one of the things I discovered when I was researching the Smith College Relief Unit was that while they were the only female relief unit that was allowed to stay on the front, right ahead of the German invasion of spring of 1918, they were not, in fact, the only female relief unit in town. There were a lot of females involved in the war, driving ambulances, bringing other sorts of aid, but we never hear about them. It's the story of the men in the trenches, the same way, you know, U.S. history is always told as the story of Paul Revere, but there were female Paul Reveres. There was Sybil Ludington and others, and it's so important to write them back into the story.
I saw you at the book festival, and I loved you with Beatrice Williams and Karen White. And I was hoping that maybe someday you could come back and bring them too.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we will be.
They were just here.
We were just here.
I didn't know how
Last
many books
May.
they had written together.
Ah,
Then I
Yes.
went online and I was like,
right.
what?
They were here last May, I think it was.
Yep, it was last May. We were here for the Lost Summers of Newport. Barbara has finally recovered from the experience.
I'm used to it. Right.
Yes, we are a little crazy when we're together.
No, you're great.
But yes, we just finished up our 5th collaboration. That book will be coming out in autumn 2024. And we call it our Knives Out meets Monarch of the Glen book. It's a madcap murder mystery set in a Scottish castle on a remote Scottish island. And we had way too much fun with this book. I can't tell you the title because I'm sworn to secrecy because we haven't made an official announcement yet, but that will be coming soon.
So I'll be back.
Thank you.
Oh yeah.
Is it okay that it's on Facebook? Do we need a clip?
No, we don't need to
Okay.
clip because I didn't tell anyone the title. That's about not allowed to tell yet. There'll be a grand Team W announcement at some point about what the title is, because people who have been to our previous events will be very amused when they hear it.
Anybody else have a question? Yes, ma'am.
I had a question. You said you try to stay away from World War II. Is it because there's such a crowded field of people writing, historical fiction about World War II, or?
It's more personal proclivities. The truth is, earlier history has always been of much more interest to me. I was the hugest early modern history snob back in college and grad school. I looked down upon anything after 1815 as all dark satanic mills and too hideously modern, because my field is really Tudor Stuart England, with a side of Scottish Renaissance, because everyone loves the Scottish Renaissance. I guess I'm just drawn to these really obscure things, but I always said the most modern I would ever go would be the Napoleonic Wars. That was the end of the known world to me. After that, it was all industrialists and just smoking factories. It was too modern. But then a friend of mine sent me this wonderful book about the Happy Valley set in Kenya, and I wound up writing a 1920s book. But so many of my 1920s characters, they had been shaped by their experience in World War I. So I wound up doing a lot of reading about World War I, like Rupert Graves's Goodbye to All That. The same guy who wrote I, Claudius, also wrote the most hilarious and tragic World War I memoir. I highly recommend it. And so I got drawn into World War I. But really, I keep drawing lines, bless you, I keep drawing lines and then going past them. But the 1920s is really the most modern I want to go. And I think part of the personal, it's very personal, but part of the personal reason I prefer the earlier conflicts to World War II is because World War II is such a clear case of good versus evil, which I think is why many people are drawn to it. But I really like muddles. I like wars where people get into them by accident, where people blunder into things generally with good intentions, and messes ensue. I think it's why I studied the English Civil War, because that's a war where people have been trying to find a point for it for generations, and there really was no point to it. It was people did one thing that led to another thing, and suddenly they're beheading the king, and no one knows how they got there. So that's the sort of thing that appeals to me personally, and that is really not World War II. But that is very much World War I, where one day you have this particular sort of aristocratic Europe with all these crowned heads who are all related to Queen Victoria, and they have a family squabble that turns into the most horrific warfare that only sci-fi writers could have imagined. And when they come out of what was supposed to be a 2-week war, like all the other little European wars they had known, suddenly the world has changed forever. So that's the sort of, so World War II, not my thing. Mm-hmm.
How do the mechanics of a collaboration work? Do you each write your own section, or are you together, or you swap it around, or what?
That's a great question. I can't tell you how other people's mechanics work because our process was idiosyncratic and accidental. So the joke is, except as Barbara knows, it's not a joke, it's true. Beatrice, Karen, and I decided we wanted to write a book together so that our publisher would pay for our bar bill and our girls' trip. Because we were drinking together at a conference one night and having so much fun. And it's so mind-bogglingly boring touring on your own, except for moments like this. But I mean, it's always depressing when you fly in at 2 in the morning and you're by yourself. It's too late for room service, so you eat the kind bar that's been in the bottom of your bag at acquired Lynch. And so we were talking about how much more fun it was to be together, and how, oh my goodness, if we wrote a book together, our publisher would pay to tour us together, and then we would have to eat a lonely kind bar. And so we had no idea how to do a collaboration. We really hadn't thought out. We got together at Alice's Teacup in New York City. Beatrice came down by train from Old Lyme. Karen flew all the way up from Georgia. I walked the 10 blocks from my apartment. And we were just going to throw around ideas and see if we could figure out sort of the vague idea for a book and how to do this thing, but our brains just meshed. We were talking about characters, we were talking about ideas, and the next thing we knew, we had our notebooks out, and we were making a chapter by chapter outline. So we outlined the whole thing together, and at the time, we were all writing dual timeline books. Books where you have a character in the present who's trying to figure out what happened in the past, what family secrets have shaped their lives that they haven't been told. And so, that go back and forth between the modern character trying to find things out and the character in the past as their story unfolds. And, the discrepancies between the two and all that. And so we decided, okay, we write dual narrative stories. Let's write a triple narrative story. 3 viewpoint characters, interwoven plot lines, and each of us then will take 1 plot line to do. So we outlined the whole thing together, and once we had come up with the whole story, then we each claimed a character. And then we went back to our layers and we wrote round robin. So the person at the first chapter wrote that, emailed it to the next person. That person read that chapter, wrote hers, emailed it on. That person read the previous 2, wrote hers, emailed it on. And so you're always reading the other 2 people's chapters right before you write your own. So we had no idea if this was going to work or if it would be a giant mess. We sent it off to our editor. And it was very funny. She was like, wow, this is actually good. Because they had really not wanted to publish this book. It was a pity buy. Everyone thought this was a terrible idea, but they really loved Karen and they wanted to keep her happy. So they pity bought it, thinking it was going to be a train wreck. And anyway, but she sent the wrong edits to the wrong authors. Oh. And we thought it was very funny because we all have very distinct voices, as those of you who may have read us know. So we thought it would be blindingly obvious who wrote what. But because we were writing round robin and reading each other's stuff, our voices melded and blended and changed. And anyway, so that's how we do it. And we always meet up after we finish the draft to edit together and smooth out any rough spots. So since that worked for the first one, that's how we've been doing it ever since. We plot it together, we write round robin, and then we edit together. And we can't believe it works, but somehow it does.
Anyone else?
I'm fascinated that you went to the trouble to go to law school and then decided to become a writer. And I gather you wanted to be a writer before, from what you had said. So could you talk a little bit about the transition and how you decided to give up the law career?
Well, I always feel like a bit of a fraud. Barbara knows all this. I feel like a bit of a fraud because I'll get invited by bar associations to do what I call my How Not to Be a Lawyer talks about transitioning from being a lawyer to an author. But I'm kind of, well, the truth of the matter is, I was a writer before I was a lawyer. So I went off to grad school to get my PhD in history on the theory that that would help me write absolutely accurate historical fiction. You know, those big doorstop novels, they're always called a rich historical tapestry. And then I realized very quickly, as a second-year grad student, that in fact doing academic history does not help you write good fiction. In fact, it does quite the contrary, because your characters have these very boring conversations about the origins of the English Civil War. And I also realized that I really hated grading undergrads. And on top of it, the real clincher was my cunning plan had been I would, you know, everyone knows academics have these long summer vacations. I could teach during the year and then write during the summers. And then I realized academics actually work really hard over the summer. You know, it is not an easy job. And so that killed that whole plan. And so for various reasons, I was at the Harvard History Department. I logged in an application to Harvard Law. My whole family are academics turned lawyers, and there had been a family pool on how long I would hold out. So the ones going for law school won, and I figured if I got into Harvard Law, I would go, and I would do a joint degree and finish my PhD while getting my JD. And if I didn't, I would try to give this academic thing a go. So I got into Harvard Law, but at the same time, while I was being a disgruntled grad student, I had written a book just for fun. It was a swashbuckling romp about spies during the Napoleonic Wars. It was sort of a feminist answer to the Scarlet Pimpernel, a mashup of Julia Quinn and Georgette Heyer and Raphael Sabatini and the Scarlet Pimpernel, and with a modern chick-lit frame featuring, surprise, a disgruntled Harvard grad student doing her research in London, not like I was one or anything. And she finds a cache of never-before-found papers, which, by the way, I had not found and was miffed about. And so, anyway, this manuscript had been discreetly handed around to close friends because it was full of in-jokes. Particularly my grad school friends would say things like, put in stuff about how your advisor never answers your emails. And so it was basically a running private joke with a few good friends, except one good friend who had a friend who was an agent, and she gave it to him. And the month before I started law school, I was wrestling with a coffee machine that I had a German tenant while I was abroad in England, and he had left me his coffee machine. And so I'm like, I can make coffee with this. And I couldn't make coffee with this. It exploded on me just as my phone rang. And some strange male voice said, hi, I'm an agent. I read your manuscript. I want to represent you. And I had coffee dripping off my nose, and I thought it was a prank. It turned out it wasn't a prank. It was a real agent, and he took on the book that later became The Secret History of the Pink Carnation. So I started Harvard Law with so my first month at Harvard Law, I signed a 2-book contract with Penguin. And my first book came out my 2L year, which was hilarious because professors would sidle up to me in the hallways and be like, you wrote a book? I've always wanted to write a novel. I would never imagined this about you. And actually, my corporations class, one of those giant 200 people classes, and there was this thing called being on deck, where you were the person being grilled that day. And suddenly, the poor person on deck the week of my pub date started being grilled about Gothic novels. And this person had no idea what was going on. And then the professor said, is Lauren Willig in the room? And I'm there in the back row, and I had another Pink Carnation book due. So I'm writing dialogue for the modern section while corporations is going on around me. I raised my hand. He's like, is it true you wrote a Gothic novel? I'm like, well, actually, it's not technically a Gothic. And we spent the rest of the class talking about genre distinctions and what makes a Gothic different from a Regency and so on. Anyway, but yes, and I wound up being a litigator at Cravath for 1.5 years, but my 3rd book came out my first week at the firm. So it was a very bizarre experience. And when I decided to leave after 1.5 years, because it was really hard juggling the two, basically everyone was like, what took you so long? But they were very nice about it. They liked to trot me out to summer associates to say, like, look, our associates do other things. We have a writer. But I was by far, actually, I have to say though, I was not the coolest person in my summer associate class. There was a guy who had been in the Broadway cast of Mamma Mia, which was way cooler. Yes. Sorry, talking like Elle Woods there.
That's one reason we bond. I too am a lawyer. So I would be more fun to do books out. So
Lapsed lawyers of the
Right.
world unite.
the Poison Pen's a not-for-profit bookstore. It's my hobby, which I really enjoy. But, except of course for the staff who actually get paid. Right?
A little hectic.
Right. Are you done there? Have you
I
run out?
think I am just about dead.
All right, then
Okay.
let's
So-
say goodbye to our virtual audience. Thank you for joining
Bye,
us.
everybody.
Right.